Ancora una volta buonasera dalle Lingue Live, eccoci qui di nuovo, ben ritrovati. L'argomento di questa sera ha a che fare con i grandi discorsi della storia, Words That Changed the World, discorsi che possono essere di ispirazione, discorsi che possono essere usati in classe anche come educational tools, come recitava l'abstract che abbiamo depositato sul sito per descrivere l'evento di questa sera. Prima di presentarvi le persone che ne parleranno, vi do alcune noiose informazioni ma utili per poter poi procedere ad avere l'attestato e anche per fare in modo che voi possiate interagire con noi. C'è possibilità di fare domande e potete inserire le vostre domande alla pagina, state tranquilli perché di tanto in tanto comparirà nella sottopancia del video, tuadomanda.it, indicando semplicemente il codice dell'evento che è 1791. L'attestato di partecipazione sarà disponibile nei prossimi giorni sul sito della casa editrice, dovete cercare la pagina attestati. L'attestato sarà disponibile solo ai partecipanti che avranno effettuato l'accesso dalla mail di conferma di iscrizione, ma avete tempo entro le 23:59 di oggi e poi boom. Il video resterà disponibile sul canale YouTube e vi metteremo a disposizione le slide sempre nella sezione archivio webinar del nostro sito. Allora, per le domande, di tanto in tanto vi verrà dato il codice dell'evento, che ripeto ancora una volta che è 1791. Silvia Chini e Leonard O'Shea. Allora, Silvia la conoscete bene. Leonard, Len, è la prima volta che è con noi. In realtà nelle report è dall'anno scorso che collabora con noi, ha fatto per noi bellissime cose. È collega di Silvia, quindi lavorano insieme al Collegio San Carlo e poi lascerò a lui la parola, anzi comincerà Len se ben ricordo. Quindi io intanto li ringrazio. Come sempre lascio loro la parola per una 45 minuti, man mano ci segniamo le vostre domande e alla fine conversiamo con voi. Io ringrazio Len per la sua prima partecipazione, come sempre ringrazio Silvia e lascio loro la parola. Grazie.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Please excuse my hesitancy, but it is my first time. As long as there have been speech or the power to speak, there have been people who have wanted to stand up and talk, to address us. Peoples and leaders, through their words and oratory powers, have shaped our lives, our civilizations, and our societies. Men and women who, for good or ill, because there's never 100% direction on these things, have been responsible for and chroniclers of milestones in our history. If something momentous, or well, actually, if something happens, we can be sure that somebody is going to stand up and talk about it. Oratory is of the now. It is of the marketplace. And as such, it is not always concerned about the universal and or the permanent. It is about the actions that are now. The orator, in his purpose and technique, is primarily there to persuade rather than to inform or entertain, in fact. It is an attempt to change human behavior or to strengthen convictions and attitudes. Also, very often, the speeches, for that is what they are, constitute a call to action. However that action may be defined, a call to arms or a mobilization of forces for a conflict, for example, to gird the loins of a nation expecting to fight, to inspire patriotism and pride, to ask not what you can do, or sorry, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, as JFK in his inaugural speech famously said. Okay. The leaders, the orators, are asking their countries or nation to believe in a vision, to believe their voice, to be prepared and to ask you or ask the people to be prepared to follow them. It's heady stuff. It's heady stuff. In other cases, the call for action might be to right a social wrong, a protest against injustice or misgovernment. Martin Luther King's, as we can see here, is the perfect example of this. The call for the end to racial segregation. A declaration of support delivered live, support and demonstration delivered live in front of thousands of people sends an extremely powerful and unignorable message to the recipients of that support, and to those who would wish to isolate or to deprive the audience of that. Martin Luther King, once again, speaking to the government, speaking to the white nation, set us free, set us free. It might also be particularly in a political sense. Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. JFK's speech to the population of Berlin. It boosted the morale of a besieged city and sent an unequivocal message to the Soviet Union surrounding the city. But we will be looking at that a little bit later. Okay. But however you look at it, there can be as many reasons for speeches as there are speakers. Extolling the virtues of a pizza parlor, for example. It's unlikely that you're going to get a huge following on YouTube for that, but you never know. But there are the greatest examples of speeches and art succeed in identifying the moment and feeling of opinion and tapping into that zeitgeist, with zeitgeist defined as the defining spirit or mood of a particular period in time. Greta Thunberg, you could say, at the moment, is tapping into that feeling. Climate change being a global issue and is at the forefront of our societal discourse. We think about it all the time. Her speeches, her presence have forced or have emboldened the youth of today to follow her and forced, frankly, the politicians who might not have been as receptive. It is possible that this is true. It forms the core of a massive worldwide spirit, and something has to be done. Great speeches can do this. They can tap this font. They can open a vast wellspring of desire and feeling that may lie beneath. Not specifically to the physical audience, because the physical audience at these speeches are supporters already of the idea. They have gathered together in support. But they are more than aware of the reasons for the gathering. But the message is being sent to the outer audience. Whether in the case of the examples we're going to see today, through radio, film, and TV. And more recently for us, we have access to the internet, which has opened a vast new method of reaching. Okay. By hearing these speeches, we might have been aware of the issues, but we were never moved enough to have a strong enough opinion. Maybe not to care, but to participate and to take part of it. Once again, taking as an example the Martin Luther King speech, it brought the plight of the Black population out of the southern states and into the national and international onto the stage. It spoke and allowed people to say, Maybe I should be more aware of these things. Okay. But what makes a great speech? It is easy to make rules. Okay, it is easy to make rules on what it makes oratory. If you go on the internet, you're going to find lists of you have to do these 9 things or these 27 things, etc., etc. The internet is awash with these points, and all of them are as valid as each other. However, we can go back a little bit pre-internet, if you like, to find the seminal manual on oratory, just a little bit before the internet, because in 55 BC, Cicero, one of Rome's finest orators, wrote his essay on oratory. And he said, in an orator, the acuteness of the logicians, the wisdom of the philosophers, the language almost of poetry, the memory of lawyers, the voice of tragedians, the gesture of almost all of the best actors is required. And after 2,000 years, this is still true today. So quite easy then to be able to carry into that. What makes a speech great? Because what makes a great speech? And then when you have what makes a great speech, the essence of a great speech is always the ability to communicate a simple message crafted to suit a chosen audience, not only through words, but also through the fusion of the character of the speaker and the message itself. The words themselves are obviously an extremely important part of it. In fact, for the King's speech of George VI, the words are incredibly important because the person himself, the delivery, was flawed. And we will look at that in a second. Okay, the words must be short without with glibness, substantial without being boring, powerful without haughtiness. All of the different things. It seems even more difficult in rocket science sometimes to be able to deliver the correct speech. However, there are 2 overarching factors: authenticity and brevity. We're all aware of the anagram, KISS, as Prince so wonderfully sang about. However, the one we mean is keep it short and simple. Leonardo da Vinci said, simplification is the ultimate sophistication. The Gettysburg Address of Lincoln was 272 words long. George VI's speech was 407. JFK's Berlin speech, 505. Brevity. Don't bore your audience. Length is not a measure of impact. We have seen demagogues and dictators who have never fully understood this, using speeches as a different form to enhance an idea of machismo. For example, Fidel Castro has been famous for going on for 7 hours. 7 hours. Martin Luther King's speech in Washington was less than 7 minutes. Then we come to authenticity. The message must be felt to be real and sincere. Because an orator intuitively expresses the fears, hopes, and attitudes of an audience, a great oration is to a large extent a reflection of those to whom it is addressed. The best speakers have the ability to make their ideas and aspirations come alive so that their audience feel they are part of something greater than themselves, part of a dream that may come true. Both JFK's inaugural speech and Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, both achieved this. Oops, sorry, forgot my slide. So we're going to have a look at I Have a Dream. So Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta in 1929. His father was a Baptist pastor. And he became part of the civil rights movement. He became a member and founded the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and was one of the junior attendees, speech orators or speech givers at the gathering in Washington in August of 1963, the March for Freedom and Jobs. Why is it so great? Martin Luther King Jr. was a consummate speaker, practiced. Cadence was his king. He was often because we often see only clips of his speeches, we don't see very often how he starts. He starts slow and in an almost conversational way. And then over time, his voice and tone rise. He varies it during the speech. And in so doing, draws his audience in. He delivers it with context. He establishes a historical context with his message. He echoes the words of Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address when it was declared emancipation. The first words of Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, 407 years ago, are brought forth. Among Martin Luther King's first speeches was 50 years ago, a great America was born. In doing this, he makes very real the sense of inclusion in a broad sweep of history and an intimate part of a call for freedom of injustice. In fact, he later relates to this and refers to this. He imbues the crowd with a mission, not only of the Black population of America, but also to the white majority. He awakens them to his vision, and even more, his vision for an equal rights for all, educating them and the world to the massive injustices at the home of Western democracy. He's authentic. As we said, the great leaders have two things in common. They have an overarching story, and their life embodies that story. He has lived the story. He is not detached from it. When he spoke, he told his story. He spoke about his daughters. He spoke about the Georgia in which he grew up in. His audience knows his story, and they know that it's true. And indeed, eventually, he dies for his story when he is assassinated. He practiced it. Okay, so he doesn't actually have any notes, and he used a lot of improvisation. However, he had been working on this for much of the content in other addresses previously. He took the time to get comfortable with his material, with what worked and what didn't work, and then in less prominent venues beforehand. And he came out fluid, rehearsed, semi-improvised. Repetition. He uses simple yet key phrases. I have a dream. As Churchill says, another quite useful speaker, if you have an important point to make, don't try to be subtle and clever. Make the point once and then go again and again. This is called apostrophe as a rhetorical device of repetition to make a phrase memorable. It's making a catchphrase. The kind of repetitive structure that makes his points clearly and eminently and makes them memorable. I have a dream. Let freedom ring out. We could possibly call this a soundbite in modern parlance. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Not easy to forget. He connects with his audience. He creates an almost symbiotic connection with his audience. They draw energy from each other and create an event that became more than just a speech, obviously. It became history itself. It became an experience that moved people to act. And the impact then is widely considered to be the turning point of the civil rights movement, shifting the demand of and demonstration for racial equality that had mostly occurred in the southern states to the national stage and, as I said before, the international stage. Another amazingly powerful speech was Ich bin ein Berliner in June 26, 1963. 2 months actually before Martin Luther King's speech in Washington, the American president was in Berlin. And this was in the context of the Cold War. In 1963, it was at its most frigid. It was the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the speech was considered then to be remarkably incendiary. Berlin, as we know, was Germany's capital at that time and was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. Initially divided into 4 sectors controlled by the Allies, it, over time, became unified, the 4 sectors. After a long escalation of tensions from the 1948 Berlin blockade, where the Soviet Union besieged the city and cut off all road and rail network, so therefore isolating the citizens from supplies that they needed from the West. The relieving of that situation by the dramatic airlift, the act of unity spotlighted Berlin's preeminence as a symbol of freedom and a propagandist thorn in the side of the communism, in the side of the communists. He went there to support them. Tensions were further heightened where the borders were then later closed in the 1950s. All of the borders were closed, and the only way the East Germans could escape to the West was through Berlin. This exodus threatened the East Germany with economic collapse. And in 1961, a barbed wire barrier was erected to prevent further escape. And it was soon followed by a concrete wall. JFK actually himself commented in 1961 that it was a poor solution, a wall, but it was better than a war. 22 months later, Kennedy took to the podium in front of an estimated 120,000 people and repeated again that Berlin was not alone. In a city living under the very real threat of Soviet occupation, it was an amazing boost to the morale. The speech had been written over the course of many weeks. It wasn't how could I put this? It wasn't improvised off the cuff. However, what JFK did was ignored the carefully scripted original and designed to be not too overly aggressive. He changed it. And it is said he changed it himself. Ted Sorensen, who was his normal speechwriter, later said in his autobiography that he changed some fundamental part, obviously, but kept a lot of the bones of the original speech. The speech itself was much more provocative than his advisors had recommended. And in doing so, he placed a heavy weight on the side of democracy and unity. He continued to push the concept of division on the side of the East and unity on the side of the West. He goes, we are. Okay. Perhaps an answer, however, later, he had a much more conciliatory speech. And in fact, Khrushchev later remarked that one would think that the speeches were made by two different presidents. However, it is not the other speech that is remembered. It is the speech that JFK made there. His wonderful cadence. Once more, he has this in common with Martin Luther King: his cadence, his delivery, and change of tone, presented, connected in a fundamental way with the crowd in front of him. He creates a connection, not only through his voice, but also through his words. Let them come. We are here in Berlin. We are together. And this he repeats 5 times. 5 times. Let them come. He is also the symbiotic relationship. He is buoyed. He's emboldened himself by the energy that he feels from the crowd. There is a relationship. And this is fundamental to the great speeches. Okay. He also repeats the signature phrase twice, as well as I said, let them come to Berlin 5 times. Once again, the repetition creating the connection. He identifies himself with the inhabitants, with his conclusion, Ich bin ein Berliner, links him internally to his listeners and to the cause of the fight against communism. The last speech I'm going to speak about is the King's speech. We are all extremely aware of this speech because we've all seen the movie. The movie obviously took some slight liberties with in the story for dramatic effect, but the idea is fundamental. Okay, it was his first speech. It was the King's first speech, and almost certainly his most momentous. The world was going to war. He had suffered, as we all know, from a quite debilitating speech impediment, a stammer. And it was the very fact that he was able to speak at all was momentous. This speech came a mere year after Neville Chamberlain's Peace in Our Time, Peace for Our Time speech, where the Declaration of Appeasement, or the Declaration of Peace with Nazi Germany, and the policy of appeasement was enacted. Something actually which George VI actually said himself. The speech itself, though, was a call to arms, presenting a very strong argument from going to war. From the very start, he establishes again a link, his link and his relationship with the crowd, with his audience. Unlike the other 2 speeches, he is in a room. He is isolated. He also connects a personal connection, calling to memory that his audience that he was in the First World War. And he, in his words, this is in the second time in our lives, for most of us, we are going to war. His reputation for a poor public speaking, which is, to say it lightly, due to his stammer, was extremely widely known. And the connection and the impact of the surprise of his eloquence and his determination won the audience over. It hadn't disappeared, his stammer. It was still noticeable. But he merely learned his way around it, and it was an extremely notable and appreciated part. The speech was there as motivation and also reassurance. The delivery required a slow, somber way. It wasn't going to be a massive cadence and arm-waving speech. The tone didn't allow that, which perfectly fitted with his capabilities. It established George as a monarch of the people, and this was further cemented by his refusal to move from Britain to Canada and take his family away in safety during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. He also adopted the rationing system in the British rationing system in the palace. So he ate. He was allowed to eat what the people were allowed to eat, so they say. The high public profile of both the king and the queen during the war and their absolute determination secured them as symbols of national resistance. And this process, the process which had begun with the speech, 407 words that inspired the nation, and then later followed by Winston Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, increased this level of national pride. What do they have the speeches got in common? They have certain things in common, of course they do. They all highlight an evil, whether it be the specter of communism, Nazism, or the homegrown racism. All three deal with the inhibitions of freedom: economic, ideological, religious, racial, and societal. All three provide a rallying call to gather together to fight this evil, and to firmly cement the roles of the three orators as leaders in their struggle, that their beliefs represent the best of their people, and that they will lead towards victory, eventual victory. The speeches, as said, in their content and in their delivery, and in the case of George VI, in their poor delivery, but is amazing, indefatigable will in delivering it, emboldened the listeners and gave them courage, pride, and hope. And as a tool itself, the speech represents freedom. Thank you very much. I will now pass you to my friend and colleague, Silvia.
Thank you. So we as teachers encourage our students to analyze, to study, to work on poems, plays, novels, short stories, but we unfortunately leave the spoken word unanalyzed. But speeches can be used for a huge variety of activities. My colleague has illustrated what basically you can do when you teach literature or educazione civica, as we said in our last webinar, culture. In the following minutes, I will try to give you some ideas on how to use great speeches with lower levels and how to use great speeches to teach oral and writing skills. So let's start with a famous one. We're not listening to the speech, but this is one of the most iconic speeches given by Nelson Mandela. It's the one in which he says, "Sport has the power to change the world." So when you use a speech like this one, or like one of the speeches that my colleague has illustrated before, your students will certainly consider the fact that the speaker is not speaking in the same way we generally speak in our everyday conversations. So the first step is to concentrate on the 4 things you see there. So voice, tone, pauses, and emphasis. So let's start from the last one. Emphasis is something that our brain does naturally. It tells the listener what is important. It brings clarity of meaning. The words we generally emphasize are the most important ones. But how do we emphasize? One of the first things is giving your students the possibility to understand why we do certain things without even understanding why at the very beginning. So we emphasize by changing the position of a word in a sentence. We emphasize by repeating the same concept as my friend has illustrated in some speeches. We emphasize by changing the volume of our voice. Volume is one of the main problems in our classes. So when our students present or when they speak, we're sometimes not able to hear. We can't hear what they say. But volume can be used. It's important to let them know. Volume can be used to give energy to the speech, to engage your audience, to convey the meaning. And also tone. if you pay attention when you will have the slides, so if you click on the link, you will listen to the speech. So when you listen to this speech, you will see that Mandela changes the tone of his voice, and speakers who can control the tone of their voice can in a way manipulate the listeners' feelings and emotions, and that's important even in our everyday conversations. And then pauses, last but not least. Well, generally pauses like fillers are used by our students when they don't know what to say or when they need time to think. But if used in the right way, pauses can give the speech a rhythm. So asking our students to familiarize, to master these things is important, not just because they need to become great speakers, okay? But even in everyday life, even when we prepare them for FCE or IELTS speaking tests. So it's important even for everyday conversations. This is why I'm trying to give you some of the exercises we generally do in class with our students to let them concentrate on delivery skills, techniques, speaking skills. This is the first one. Okay, pick a sentence, the most boring you can think of. In this case, Beowulf is the first written text in English. It is anonymous, and even if it was written in Old English, the setting is not England. You can write whatever you want, basically. And you can ask your students, you can give your students a couple of minutes to familiarize with this sentence. And then you can ask your students to read this sentence according to some information you give them. One possibility is the website I'm showing you right now. One possibility is this. You use something like this. It's an emotion wheel. You spin it. You will see an emotion. Okay, in this case, sad. You will ask one of your students to read the sentence pretending he's super sad. So the student has to use the voice, the tone, pauses, everything, in order to convey the fact, to transmit the fact that he's super sad. You can use some emotions from this wheel, or you can simply write some cards. And you can give them situations. For example, you can ask them to pretend to be at a central station, rush hour, and they had to communicate with a friend who is on the other side of the central hall. So they need to shout. So giving them different situations, different emotions, you will give them the possibility to work and to familiarize with the possibilities of their voices and tones and pitches and poses. It's a funny thing, to be honest. It's great fun in the lesson, but it's a thing that will help them concentrate on how they speak, not just the words they say. Another possibility is this one. This is super useful to help them cooperating. So when we ask them to present things in small groups, okay, we give them presentations to do. They generally don't know who is speaking first. Okay, that's the end of my part. They say, it's your turn. Then we have silence, and then the other students begins. So this is a good way to help them cooperating during presentations. You write a sentence, once again, whatever you want. In this case, Jim went to see his mother. And you divide your class into groups. In this case, we have 6 words into groups of 6. You give each student a word, and they have to read the sentence faster and faster until the 6 voices sound like one person. It seems stupid, I know, but it's a useful exercise to help them understanding how to cooperate without pauses, without silence, just understanding when their turn is and other things. So these are just 2 exercises. If you look online and you write drama exercises on Google, you type drama exercises for public speaking, you will find a lot of activities. It's great fun working on public speaking in class. We generally do it towards the end of the second year, okay, but in the middle of the second year, towards the end, yes, it depends. Because once they have a certain knowledge of the language, they can start working on something more. They can start working on something different. They can concentrate on delivering speaking skills. Well, then we have this nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is as important as word search and public speaking techniques. Think about our students presenting. They look at the teachers. They do not consider the rest of the class. They destroy some pieces of paper in some cases they have with them, or they play with bracelets while they're speaking because they're anxious. Well, non-verbal communication is important. As you can see here from the slides, non-verbal communication, body language is 70% of the speech of public speaking. So it's super important. So this is why it's useful also to focus on non-verbal communication. When a public speaker's non-verbal communication skills are effective, the message is conveyed in a better way. I mean, we're not JFK, we're not going and giving a speech in front of 1,000 people, but even in class, even in our everyday life, even when preparing students for FCE, IELTS, proficiency or other things, that's important. So I'm giving you now some examples, what you can focus on with your students. So teaching them how to behave when presenting, when giving a speech, smiling, looking at their classmates, not just the teacher, using hands, gestures. Okay, the Italians are great at this. Or smiling. Well, the attitude is important. And in some cases, when you give a feedback after a presentation, you can consider some non-verbal communication aspects. If they gave if they had a great presentation, but the non-verbal communication was not that great, not particularly brilliant, you can tell them, next time, try to look at your classmates, try to engage them. It's just tiny things that put together will help your students understanding how to present, how to behave in front of other people, how to manage and master public speaking skills. This is another example. This is a short exercise, let's say 20 minutes, not more, to help your students improving non-verbal communication. Basically, you separate students into pairs, okay? And you give a copy of a simple script like this one, or you can write a super simple script. And you can give them a couple of minutes to familiarize with the script. And then you ask some students to act silently. So they have to perform, to play this script without saying a single word. And the rest of the class sitting has to write down a summary of the story, a summary of the play they're seeing in that moment in class. Of course, these activities, not just this one, but even the previous ones, are exaggerated. But through exaggerations, okay, we give our students the possibility to understand how to behave while they're speaking, okay? They will laugh, somebody will say, no, I don't do these things, but these are useful things to understand how to master public speaking skills. And not just the word choice, not just the way you speak, not just fluency, but public speaking in general. And after concentrating on emotions, poses, rhythm, gestures, so non-verbal communication, you can ask your students to make a challenge. So you can organize a challenge. You can ask your students to prepare for 2 minutes, to speak for 2 minutes on a random topic. You have 3 there, but you can choose whatever you want, even according to what you're studying with your students. The ones I put here are things I learned in lockdown. Okay, books are better than the movies, or make public transport free, something they would like to speak about. You give them one emotion using the emotion wheel I had before, or giving cards, or just simply communicating it. And okay, yes, 2 minutes, one random topic, one emotion, 2 minutes. You will ask them to give a speech, okay? This is useful not just to practice public speaking skills, but also to prepare the IELTS speaking part. In the IELTS speaking part, they have to speak for 2 minutes on a random topic because they pick a card in that moment. And of course, if they master nonverbal communication, tone, volume, poses, rhythm, well, the speaking test will get a good grade, probably a better one. But speeches are not just meant to practice oral skills, to improve oral skills. We can use speeches, great speeches, also for speaking skills, writing skills. And well, when we speak about analyzing a speech, we speak about rhetorical analysis, okay? The main goal of rhetorical analysis is to explain what is happening in the text, why the author may have chosen to use that particular set of words, how these choices affect the final result. We've seen in the previous JFK and MLK, the previous speeches, that they deliberately decided to repeat some sentences, to emphasize something. So analyzing a speech is trying to understand why, the reasons why. Here you have two examples. One, the first one is a graphic novel on rhetorical analysis. The other one is a classical English rhetorical analysis. But you can use some of the elements given to help your students understanding why, the reasons why that author, that speaker has chosen a particular word or repetition or emphasis or pause. And analyzing a speech is useful to improve writing skills. Because after learning the techniques, after learning something about the purpose, the audience, the topic, the writer, the context, after learning about these things, you can ask your students to use what they've learned to write not only speeches, but every single piece of writing. You will find some examples of rhetorical analysis and some ready-made materials in Great Speeches, the book Great Speeches. You can find great speeches here. I will show you. If you go to Hub Scuola and you click on Lit Hub, okay, you have Contenuti Digitali Integrativi volume. As you can see here, you have Materiali Docente, and you have Guida Docente Great Inspirations. Okay, you can download it, and you will find a section called Great Speeches. You will find a section called Great Speeches. In this section, you will find a lot of great speeches with some exercises you can use in class. Generally, you have some warm-up activities just to understand something more about the context, which is part of rhetorical analysis. Then you have the speech. There's always a link. You can listen to the speech with your students. And after the speech, you have some exercises to help your students focusing on rhetorical analysis and then moving from theory to practice, basically. There's always an exercise that asks your students to do something with what they've learned. So it can be an oral task, it can be a written one, but it's always helping them moving from theory to practice. If you don't have great speeches, great inspirations, don't worry, because we will provide you the pages of the speeches we're going to take into consideration in this webinar. And well, so this is an example. This is one of the most famous speeches by Winston Churchill. And you can see that the exercises focus on context, purpose, topic, the writer. So your students are asked to highlight repetitions, alliterations, metaphors, and even the tone, because when you listen to the speech, you can analyze even the tone. And of course, you can ask your students to move from ink to voice, or from voice to ink. Since we're practicing here writing skills, you can ask your students to prepare a speech. The structure is always the same, so you can use this activity even to prepare something for FCE or IELTS or for whatever you want piece of writing, because the structure is always introduction, main body, conclusion. But you ask your students to think about the audience, to think about the purpose. So why are they giving this speech? Okay, because it's a part of my homework. Okay, but why? What's the reason why? Do I want to convince my classmates of a particular thing? The audience. Am I giving the speech to my classmates, to some teachers? You can ask them to prepare speeches for different people. So you can ask them to prepare a speech for the headmaster. You can ask them to prepare a speech for their classmates. You can do whatever you want. Then they need some pieces of information, so research. This is a useful reading activity as well. If you ask them to research on, for example, newspapers or TV news on TV, for example, or specific programs. So it's also a good activity. Then, of course, they write an outline. So they start working. They write. And what you can ask them to do is to read it again and find interesting words to change the, let's say, normal words they've used. Just to give you an example, are you working on a unit on your book? Are you working on landscapes? Okay, you're speaking about landscapes. And you can ask your students to prepare something related to landscapes or climate change or lockdown or COVID pandemics. So you can ask your students to write a speech on something that you're teaching in that moment, you're explaining in classes, so that they can use the vocabulary you're giving them, you're teaching. After writing it, they read it again, and with the vocabulary you are using in class, you're giving them in class, with the vocabulary there, they can use some of the words, of the interesting words they've studied with you, to replace some normal words or repetitions they've used in their speeches. This is a good way to let them improve, to boost their vocabulary, because they have the list there of the words you're teaching in that specific moment. But they can use them in their speeches, so they actively use them. And then they practice. Give them a week, 2 weeks, whatever they want to practice, to give the speech. And once they're ready, you can organize a TED Talk competition. TED Talk competitions are always good for students, even at lower levels. And you can ask them to make a video of their speech. You can ask them to perform in class. And you will have an oral mark. You can evaluate this, and they can put into practice all the things that you've studied together. You can analyze speeches by Greta Thunberg if you're dealing with educazione civica. You can analyze speeches by the king or the Prime Minister Winston Churchill if you're teaching literature. You can analyze speeches by writers, J.K. Rowling, if you're teaching something related to books, for example. There's a good example in Great Inspirations. You can do whatever you want, and you will give your students the possibility to learn from great people, great speeches, great words that influence the world, and they can have something to say. They can add their voice. So speeches are a good way to teach, not just literature and culture, but even oral and writing skills. And it will be a different way to teach. It will be engaging, and it's difficult at the beginning, okay, even for teachers. It's a bit time consuming. Yes, I know that somebody will say it's time consuming. Yes, but it will be a success. Thank you.
Allora, grazie molte Silvia, grazie anche molte a Len, che era la sua prima volta. Eccolo lì di nuovo. Grazie. Allora, sentite, io ho raccolto un pochino di indicazioni, spunti e domande che sono arrivate dalle persone che vi ascoltavano, per cui partirei con qualche spunto. Allora, intanto, come valutare queste attività? Che è un po'... essendo queste forse attività, essendo questi esercizi che non sono rubricabili alla categoria risposte chiuse, forse valgono lo spunto di alcuni criteri che possono essere usati più di una volta e condivisi con i ragazzi per portare poi ad una valutazione che sia quindi di sostegno e anche di sostanza. Chi vuole rispondere?
Allora, best case si fanno delle rubriche di valutazione.
Ecco, che è quello che appunto qualcuno di loro sta scrivendo.
Stiamo preparando i ragazzi magari per un first o per un IELTS, possiamo prendere delle indicazioni da quelle griglie. Banalmente su Google si trovano tantissime griglie già pronte anche per la valutazione dei discorsi. Secondo me una cosa che noi facciamo spessissimo è inserire l'utilizzo del vocabolario che stiamo facendo in quel dato periodo in classe come criterio per valutare il discorso. Quindi stiamo facendo l'unità sulla cucina, stiamo facendo l'unità sugli edifici in città, piuttosto che uno dei criteri di valutazione sarà quanto sono stato in grado di utilizzare il vocabolario proposto nelle altre lezioni. Quindi questo è un modo per riciclare sempre e comunque quello che si fa e far sì che sia un tutt'uno, non la parte degli speeches che sta lì nel suo cassettino, ma sia comunque parte di quella crescita che noi vogliamo vedere nei nostri studenti. Per quanto riguarda la valutazione scritta, possiamo comunque pensare di valutare le griglie che usiamo per gli essay vanno abbastanza bene, ecco, adattandole un pochino, però fondamentalmente per lo scritto è più un esercizio, ecco, la valutazione, quantomeno noi ci concentriamo su questo, sulla valutazione orale, mentre lo scritto è proprio un esercizio per arrivare poi a un qualcosa di diverso.
Grazie Silvia. Allora, un altro spunto che mi pare fosse arrivato da Len. Allora, ad un certo punto si è parlato di national pride and speeches, quindi una delle grosse questioni è quella. Allora, qualcuno sottolineava che potrebbe essere una buona occasione di lavoro interculturale. Se avete dei consigli o se avete mai provato a lavorare in classe con alcuni dei discorsi che avete citato o con altri che avete magari presenti, da mettere a paragone con discorsi italiani o in altre lingue, per chi magari, che ne so, al liceo linguistico invece ha esperienze di lingue e personaggi diversi.
Allora, abbiamo esperienza, diciamo, di lavori interdisciplinari, soprattutto per quanto riguarda le ultime classi, quindi dove alla fine i programmi vanno molto spesso appaiati, quindi per esempio affrontare la guerra mondiale attraverso i discorsi di Churchill ci aiuta moltissimo a lavorare insieme alle colleghe di spagnolo, di francese, anche loro prendono i discorsi dello stesso periodo. Abbiamo un lavoro, l'avevamo già presentato un po' di tempo fa, però sicuramente è un lavoro che vale la pena ricitare, che è uno di quelli che ha più successo anche tra gli studenti, è la cooperazione tra inglese, arte e storia, quando si parla di seconda guerra mondiale, con i discorsi di Hitler e tedesco ovviamente, i discorsi di Hitler quando parlava, anche quelli non più famosi, quando parlava di voler creare il suo museo personale a Linz. Allora noi parliamo dei Monuments Men e prendiamo i discorsi, per quanto riguarda inglese, i discorsi del capitano del gruppo dei Monuments Men. Adesso tutti abbiamo visto il film, la storia è leggermente romanzata, un po' romanzata nel film, però la sostanza è quella. Noi prendiamo i discorsi del capitano di questo gruppo dei Monuments Men e il collega d'italiano prende i discorsi, perché pochi lo sanno, ma c'è anche una squadra di Monuments Men italiani capeggiata da un docente di storia dell'arte, e lui prende i discorsi della squadra dei Monuments Men italiani facendo un confronto e poi con le cartine proprio alla mano, con i fatti storici alla mano della seconda guerra mondiale, si va a vedere di fatto cosa è successo a queste opere d'arte e come tutti abbiano cercato di preservare il patrimonio artistico e culturale dell'umanità, fondamentalmente.
Grazie Silvia. Nel mentre ci sono suggerimenti appunto sulla chat dei commenti, per cui qualcuno usa a scuola The Great Dictator's Speech, che c'è appunto anche in Great Inspirations, qualcun altro appunto suggerisce Blood, Sweat and Tears, Sassoon's Declaration for the House of Commons, eccetera. Quindi alcuni spunti anche tra colleghi. Ancora una nota sulla valutazione. Evaluation isn't always a problem, but looking for the proper sources is a very big problem. Non so se siate d'accordo, e quindi in questo effettivamente forse magari poi con gli anni provare con i ragazzi e mettersi da parte le buone idee forse può portare poi pian piano a fare meno fatica anche dal punto di vista dell'insegnante.
Sì, è vero.
È vero, quindi appunto time consuming,
l'ho detto, infatti l'ho detto.
È proprio quello che poi è un pochino più trascinante e motivante da parte degli studenti, ed effettivamente si dà poi loro un'occasione all'inizio magari di timida partecipazione e poi davvero molte volte invece vediamo cose molto belle.
Si può partire da Great Inspirations, lì ci sono la parte time consuming l'abbiamo fatta un po' noi, e quindi si può partire con quello, non bisogna partire con 1000 cose, si può partire con 1 o 2 cose, potete partire da lì e poi piano piano, anche noi siamo partiti con 1 e poi piano piano si aggiunge, è anche vero che non si può passare un anno sui great speeches, quindi quando per ogni classe per ogni anno ne abbiamo 2/3, siamo più che a posto, ecco, perché è vero che
un tassello in più che si aggiunge alla didattica, quella di tutti i giorni, no? Che dà un po' il gusto anche.
È vero che poi possiamo usarli, come dicevamo, per educazione civica, per letteratura, per cultura, per tutto, però oggettivamente non c'è solo questo.
Nowadays, speeches might be the ones at COP26. My students watch and listen, some of them live, che è di nuovo un bello spunto. Allora, grazie a chi ce l'ha suggerito. Allora, io vi ringrazio moltissimo. Occupo ancora un minuto perché, come spesso succede, c'è chi chiede dove si può trovare Great Inspirations. Allora, Great Inspirations di fatto è un servizio, una seconda guida dell'insegnante che Silvia e Elena hanno contribuito in grandissima parte a scrivere, che noi abbiamo messo, diciamo, accanto ad una pubblicazione di letteratura di Rizzoli Languages che si intitola Lit Up. Quello che faremo appunto è, man mano che proponiamo webinar o momenti di formazione, è estrapolare alcuni dei documenti, appunto i pezzi di lavoro time consuming, in modo tale che possano tornare a voi come lezioni già pronte, e ve li metteremo a disposizione anche per chi non adotta letteratura o non ha il volume, in modo tale che possiate utilizzarli in classe. Insomma, ci auguriamo che quello che trovate possa essere inspiring, come noi immaginiamo sia. Quindi io ringrazio tantissimo Silvia e Len. A Silvia devo dire che qualcuno ha scritto "Lucky Silvia to work with an Irishman".
She's right, or he is right.
Non abbiamo detto dei podcast, ci siamo dimenticati.
Allora, ti lascio la parola perché questa gente non si ferma mai, noi li stimiamo.
Proprio sui great speeches ci sarà, prodotti da noi, una serie di podcast che vi aiuterà, speriamo. Saranno cose brevi, non vi annoieremo, cercheremo di non annoiarvi, che vi aiuterà a portare i great speeches in classe, e non saranno proprio i classici che si sentono sempre. Abbiamo cercato di pescare tra cose abbastanza innovative e inusuali, proprio per dare la possibilità a tutti, licei e non licei e qualsiasi tipo di scuola, di inserire un great speech nel proprio programma.
Ultima cosa, c'è qualcuno che mi incuriosisce molto, perché c'è un "Making your bed speech is amazing", e io ammetto la mia ignoranza, ma andrò a cercarlo.
Sarà nel podcast.
Benissimo, sentite, vi ringrazio davvero tanto, ci sono molti ringraziamenti che poi magari potrete vedere o che poi vi passiamo, e insomma buona serata a voi e buona serata anche a tutte le persone che sono state con noi. Alla prossima.
Thank you. Bye now.